The room is quiet, but your body isn't. Even in stillness, something watches the door. A small tightening in the chest, a faint readiness in the jaw, as if life could change in one sentence, one message, one glance. And here is the strange truth. Fear rarely announces itself as fear. It arrives wearing smarter masks. Be realistic, don't risk it, wait until you're ready. It speaks in a voice that sounds like you, but isn't always yours. Imagine fear as a broadcast signal. It doesn't need chains or locks. It only needs repetition. If it can repeat the same warning enough times, it becomes your default setting, your normal, your identity. Tonight, listen closely. Who taught you what to fear? Was it a moment, a memory, a face? Was it a culture that rewarded obedience more than aliveness? Or was it a wound that never got the language it deserved? Fear can protect you from fire, but fear can also keep you from sunlight. And if you've been carrying it for years, you may not even feel the weight anymore. You just call it me. So let's begin where all unprogramming begins. Not with force, but with recognition. Not with battle, but with sight. Because the moment you can name the signal, you can start turning down the volume. And the next question appears like a key in your palm. What if fear is not your truth, but your training? The first classroom was a cave, picture. A cave long before calendars, long before alphabets. Outside, the night is alive with teeth and thunder. Inside, a small fire makes the walls move. Shadows stretch, shrink, turn ordinary rocks into prowling beasts. That first fear was honest. It kept our ancestors alert. It kept children close. It kept tribes alive. Yet something happened in those caves that still matters now. Humans didn't only run from fear, they painted it. On stone walls, they drew the animals they dreaded, the storms they couldn't control, the hunt that could fail. In doing so, they created a ritual without calling it one, bringing terror into view until it could be faced. Myths were born from this impulse. Take what overwhelms you and shape it into a story you can walk through. Joseph Campbell later described the hero's call as a summons to cross a threshold. Often, that threshold is guarded by dread. So fear began as a guardian, not of punishment, but of passage. And maybe the oldest lesson is this: the cave did not remove fear. It gave fear a place to be seen. Now notice how different that is from modern life. We rarely give fear a place. We hide it behind scrolling. We dress it up. The shaman who befriended the dark before fear was diagnosed, medicated, or motivationally reframed, it was entered. In many early cultures, when someone was struck by overwhelming dread, recurring nightmares, or strange visions, they weren't sent away. They were called forward. There is an old story told among Siberian and Central Asian tribes. A young hunter begins to hear sounds no one else hears. His sleep fractures. His body trembles for no reason. The elders do not label him broken. They say, "The spirits are knocking." He is taken from the village and left alone in the forest for days, sometimes weeks. No weapons, no reassurance. Only fire, breath, and night. At first, terror floods him. Every snapping twig feels like death approaching. His mind invents shapes in the dark. His body shakes as if trying to run without moving. This is the moment most of us know well. The urge to escape, to suppress, to return to the familiar. But there is nowhere to go, so he stays. And something remarkable happens. The fear does not kill him. It moves, it rises, crests, and falls like a wave. He begins to notice its rhythm, His breath slows. The forest does not attack. The night listens. By the final days, the sounds that once threatened now guide. He returns changed, not fearless, but no longer ruled. Modern psychology would say his nervous system completed a cycle it had never been allowed to finish. Somatic thinkers later described this truth plainly. The body remembers what the mind avoids. When fear is interrupted, cut short by distraction or denial, it becomes stored tension. When it is allowed to complete its arc, it transforms. This is why the shaman was often someone who had suffered deeply, not because pain grants wisdom, but because staying present through fear rewires perception. What once felt like annihilation becomes information. Pause here for a moment. Recall a fear you never fully felt, one you talked your way out of, worked around, or buried under busyness. Where does it live in your body now? Jaw, shoulders, stomach? Ancient cultures didn't ask, "How do I get rid of this?" They asked, "What is this shaping me into?" The hunter returns to the village not cured, but attuned. He can enter the dark without losing himself, and that is the real initiation. Not the absence of fear, but a new relationship with it. The question that lingers is unsettling and powerful. What if the fears that trouble you most are not signs of weakness, but invitations you've been taught to ignore? The two fears, not all fear is the same, though it feels that way in the body. One kind sharpens your senses, steadies your breath, and moves you out of harm's way. The other tightens slowly, quietly, until it becomes the lens through which you see everything. Learning to tell them apart is one of the most important skills a human being can develop. And almost no one teaches it. The first fear is ancient. It belongs to the nervous system. Step too close to a cliff and it pulls you back. Hear a sudden crack in the night and it wakes you instantly. This fear has a beginning, a peak, and an end. Once the danger passes, it releases you. Marcus Aurelius hinted at this distinction when he wrote that some impressions arrive uninvited, but our judgment of them is where freedom lives. This fear protects the body, then lets go. The second fear is learned. It does not come from the present moment, but from memory and imagination braided together. It whispers long after the threat is gone. It predicts humiliation before it happens. It rehearses loss that hasn't arrived. Over time, it stops feeling like fear and starts feeling like common sense. There is a small folktale from Eastern Europe about a traveler crossing a plain at dusk. He sees dark figures moving in the distance and is certain they are bandits. His heart races. He hides, waits, reroutes, loses hours. When dawn finally comes, he realizes the figures were nothing more than coats hanging on fence posts, swaying in the wind. Nothing chased him, yet his fear dictated every step. This is the fear that governs modern life. It is reinforced by repetition, by parents who meant well but warned constantly, by schools that punish mistakes, by systems that reward conformity and quietly discourage courage. Over time, this fear no longer needs an external trigger. It becomes internal policy. Psychologically, this fear thrives on uncertainty. The mind would rather cling to a painful familiar story than face the unknown. Daniel Kahneman described how quickly the brain jumps to threat-based conclusions, favoring speed over accuracy. The result is a life spent reacting to shadows. Pause and notice something subtle. When fear arises, does it point to a real, immediate danger? Or to a story about what might happen to who you think you are? This distinction changes everything. One fear asks for action, the other asks for awareness. When you respond to imagined fear as if it were real, you shrink your world. When you observe it without obeying, something loosens. Space returns, choice returns. And here is the quiet turning point. The moment you realize that much of what has held you back was never protecting your life, only protecting an identity that learned safety by staying small. The next question waits patiently beneath the surface. Who would you be if you stopped confusing inherited fear with truth? The marketplace of insecurity. Walk through any modern city, physical or digital, and you'll feel it humming beneath the surface. Not joy, not calm, a low-grade urgency. Screens flash reminders of what you lack. Voices suggest who you should become. Somewhere along the way, fear learned how to dress itself as desire. This is not accidental. Erich Fromm once observed that when people are offered freedom, they often flee from it. Not because freedom is frightening in itself, but because it removes excuses. A free person must choose, and choice means responsibility. Fear thrives where responsibility feels unbearable. So a marketplace was built around insecurity. You are told to fear being ordinary, fear aging, fear falling behind, fear being unseen. Each fear arrives with a proposed solution. Buy this, follow that, fix yourself here. The promise is relief. The result is dependence. Fear no longer guards the edge of danger, it manages behavior. Imagine a woman scrolling late at night. Her life is not collapsing. No immediate threat is present. Yet her chest tightens as she compares her quiet room to curated images of success and happiness. She feels behind, though no race was ever agreed upon. This is fear without a predator. Fear of exclusion, fear of insignificance. And it works precisely because it feels personal. Psychologically, this taps into an old mechanism. Belonging once meant survival. To be cast out was to face death. Modern systems borrow this ancient wiring and redirect it. The threat is no longer exile from the tribe, but invisibility in the crowd. Not starvation, but irrelevance. Ancient wisdom warned about this long ago. In the Taoist tradition, Laozi noted that desire multiplied by comparison creates unrest. When worth is measured externally, fear becomes endless because the scale never stops moving. Pause and sense the subtle shift. How many of your worries arrive not from your actual life, but from imagined rankings, from measuring yourself against ideals that keep changing? This kind of fear does not shout, it nudges. It suggests you are always almost enough, but not quite. And that almost keeps you running. Here is the hidden cost. When fear is tied to identity, you stop listening inwardly. Your choices no longer come from clarity, but from avoidance. Not what matters to me, but what will keep me safe from judgment. The marketplace of insecurity cannot survive without your participation. The moment you question its premises, its spell weakens, and a new curiosity begins to form. What would remain of your life if you removed the fears that were never yours to begin with? The temple that trained your nervous system before fear was marketed, quantified, or managed, it was evoked with intention. Step into an ancient temple and notice how little it resembles modern spaces of comfort. The corridors narrow, light fades, sound changes. Your footsteps echo as if someone else is walking with you. Incense thickens the air, time slows. This was not accidental architecture. It was psychological design. Ancient builders understood something we are only rediscovering now. Environments train the nervous system. They knew that fear, when framed correctly, does not fragment the mind, it focuses it. In the hush of temples in Egypt, Greece, India, and Mesoamerica, the body was gently pushed out of ordinary awareness and into heightened presence. Awe and unease mixed. The familiar sense of control loosened. William James later described religious experience as a shift in perception rather than belief. The temple created that shift not through explanation, but through sensation. Darkness invited attention. Silence amplified inner noise. Fear rose, not as panic, but as alertness to something larger than the self. Imagine entering such a space for the first time. Your mind reaches for stories. Your body tightens. You feel watched, though no one is there. This is the moment of threshold. The temple does not reassure you. It does not distract you. It waits. Modern life does the opposite. When discomfort appears, it rushes to cover it with stimulation. Notifications, background noise, endless commentary. The nervous system is never allowed to settle into stillness long enough to complete a cycle. Fear remains half-formed, unresolved, lingering. In the temple, fear had a container, and within that container, something remarkable happened. It transformed into reverence. The same energy that once scanned for danger began to sense meaning. The ego softened, attention widened. Pause and picture a place where silence feels thick, where even your breath sounds loud. How quickly would your mind try to escape? And what might happen if you stayed? There is a lesson here that reaches far beyond stone walls. Fear intensifies when it is rushed, denied, or drowned out. It reorganizes when it is met with steadiness. The temple trained the nervous system to hold intensity without collapse, to remain present without explanation, to feel small without feeling threatened. And that training carries a quiet implication. If fear can be shaped by space, ritual, and attention, then perhaps it is not the enemy we believed, but a force that responds to how we meet it. Which raises the next question, subtle but unsettling. If environments can amplify or soothe fear, what unseen structures in your daily life are silently training your reactions right now? The conditioning loop, by the time you were old enough to question fear, it had already learned your schedule. It showed up in classrooms where wrong answers were quietly punished with embarrassment. It appeared in homes where love felt conditional on performance or obedience. It lingered in moments where curiosity was met with "don't," "be careful," or "that's not realistic." None of this required cruelty. Fear spreads most efficiently through good intentions, repeated without awareness. This is how a loop forms. First, a moment of discomfort, then a reaction, then relief. The nervous system learns quickly, avoid this and you'll be safe. Over time, the avoidance becomes automatic. You don't even feel afraid anymore, you just don't try. The loop completes itself so smoothly that it disappears from sight. There's an old parable about a donkey tied to a wooden stake. At first, it pulls and resists, but the rope is strong and the effort hurts. Eventually, it stops trying. Years later, the rope is replaced with a thin string. The donkey remains still, not because it's trapped, but because it learned that resistance was pointless. Many lives follow this pattern. Psychologically, this is conditioning at work. The mind prefers predictability over truth. Daniel Kahneman described how quickly we default to familiar mental shortcuts, even when they no longer serve us. The brain's goal is efficiency, not freedom. Once a fear response proves useful, it becomes policy. Notice how this shows up daily. You hesitate before speaking, not because you're in danger, but because you once were judged. You avoid change, not because it's wrong, but because uncertainty feels like threat. The body reacts before the mind can question it. Pause here. Think of a choice you stopped considering years ago. When did you last check whether the rope was still real? The conditioning loop thrives on one belief: what happened before will happen again. Yet life rarely repeats itself so faithfully. Circumstances shift, you change, resources grow. But the loop doesn't update unless it's interrupted. Ancient Stoics warned that we suffer more from imagination than from reality, not because imagination is weak, but because it is powerful enough to simulate danger convincingly. The body responds as if the threat were present, even when it exists only as memory. The loop can feel like fate, but fate doesn't tighten gradually. Conditioning does. And here is the subtle opening. The moment you notice the loop, you are no longer entirely inside it. Awareness creates friction, a pause, a chance to choose differently. The next question is quietly radical. If much of your fear is learned through repetition, what might happen if you began repeating a different response? Not bravery, not force, but simple, conscious noticing? The story of the invisible cage. There is a kind of prison with no walls, no bars, no guards. Most people never realize they are inside it because it feels like personality, like preference, like this is just how I am. Imagine a bird raised in a small cage from birth. One day, the door is left open. The sky is wide, the air is clear. Nothing stops the bird from leaving except habit. It hops to the edge, feels the unfamiliar openness, and retreats. Not because it is trapped, but because freedom feels unsafe. This is how fear becomes identity. At some point, fear stops being a reaction to life and becomes a story about who you are. I'm not the kind of person who takes risks. I'm bad at conflict. I've always been anxious. These sentences sound descriptive, but they function as boundaries. They define the limits of your movement. Psychology has a name for this pattern, though the experience is older than language. When effort repeatedly feels pointless, the mind concludes that effort itself is dangerous. Not exhausting, dangerous. The nervous system learns that stillness is safer than motion. Compliance, safer than curiosity. Viktor Frankl, who lived under conditions designed to erase human agency, noticed something profound. Even when external freedom is removed, inner orientation still matters. Those who survived with their spirit intact were not the strongest, but those who found meaning beyond immediate fear. Meaning broke the illusion of total captivity. Pause and sense this carefully. Where in your life do you say, I can't, when the truth might be, I'm afraid to feel what comes next? The invisible cage is reinforced by repetition, but it is weakened by truth. Not the loud kind, the quiet, uncomfortable kind. The truth that says, this fear once protected me, but now it confines me. Ancient myths often describe heroes imprisoned not by chains, but by spells, a sleep, an enchantment. The moment of liberation doesn't come through force. It comes through recognition. The spell breaks when the hero remembers who they were before forgetting. Fear maintains its power by convincing you that it is reality, not conditioning, that the cage is the world. But the moment you test the edges, even slightly, the illusion wavers. Try this reflection gently. Think of one rule you live by that was never consciously chosen. Who gave it to you? Under what circumstances? And does it still serve the life you are living now? The invisible cage does not disappear all at once. It loosens with every honest question, every small act of presence, where you don't obey fear automatically. And this leads to a turning realization. The door was never locked. It was simply never questioned. When fear pretends to be you, there comes a moment when fear becomes so familiar that it borrows your name. It doesn't announce itself as an intruder. It speaks in the first person. I don't like crowds. I'm not ambitious. I need certainty. And because the voice sounds intimate, it is rarely questioned. This is the most effective disguise fear ever learned. Carl Jung observed that what we refuse to face within ourselves does not disappear. It acts out our lives from behind the scenes. Fear, when ignored, becomes a quiet author. It edits your choices. It rewrites your desires. It decides what feels possible long before you arrive at a decision point. There is an old Greek myth about Perseus sent to face Medusa. Anyone who looked directly at her turned to stone. The danger was not Medusa herself, but the way she was seen. Perseus survived not by attacking blindly, but by using reflection, looking through a polished shield. Indirect sight preserved movement. Fear works the same way. When you stare at it head-on without awareness, it freezes you. When you deny it, it tightens its grip. But when you observe it as an experience rather than an identity, something shifts. Movement returns. Pause here and listen inwardly. Notice the sentences that start with "I am" when fear is present. Are they descriptions of reality or inherited conclusions? Psychologically, this confusion is understandable. The brain links repeated emotional states with self-concept. If fear has been present during formative moments, failure, rejection, instability, it becomes woven into your sense of who you are. Over time, fear no longer feels like a signal. It feels like character. But character can be questioned. Think of a time when you acted against your usual pattern. A moment of unexpected courage, honesty, or calm. That moment alone disproves the idea that fear defines you. It shows that fear is a state, not a self. Ancient teachings often pointed to this distinction. In the Upanishads, the observer is described as separate from thoughts and emotions, like the sky untouched by passing clouds. The clouds feel personal because they pass through your field of experience, but they are not the field itself. Try a simple practice now. When fear arises, replace "I'm afraid" with "fear is present." Notice the difference. One statement fuses fear with identity. The other creates space. That space is not denial, it is clarity. And clarity reveals something quietly liberating. If fear can pretend to be you, then you are more than fear has ever allowed you to imagine. The next realization follows naturally, almost inevitably. If fear is not who you are, then what has it been protecting all this time? And what waits on the other side of that protection? The desert night. There is a place every tradition returns to when language runs out. A place without shelter, without distraction, without witnesses. The desert, not only of sand and stone, but of inner barrenness. The moment when familiar comforts fall away and nothing answers back. Stories place this moment at the center for a reason. In ancient texts, prophets, sages, and seekers are led away from crowds into emptiness, not as punishment, but as preparation. In the desert, fear grows louder because nothing competes with it. No roles to perform, no mirrors to reassure. Just breath, heat, and time. Imagine walking alone as night falls. the horizon dissolves, the temperature drops. Every sound feels amplified. The mind, deprived of stimulation, turns inward and begins projecting old images. Mistakes, regrets, imagined futures. This is not failure. This is exposure. Biblical wilderness stories describe this as a testing ground, but not in the way we usually think. The test is not endurance, it is honesty. Without structures to lean on, whatever has been hidden surfaces. Fear often reaches its peak here. Not fear of physical harm, but fear of meaninglessness, of insignificance, of being unprotected by the stories that once defined you. The ego, which thrives on certainty, panics when certainty disappears. Yet, something subtle happens if you remain. The desert does not attack, it does not chase, it waits. And as the hours pass, the mind's frantic narratives begin to lose momentum. Thoughts repeat, then thin. The body adjusts, breath steadies. A strange clarity emerges, not comfort, but simplicity. Ancient mystics describe this as the stripping away of false supports. When fear can no longer borrow energy from distraction, it reveals its true size, smaller than imagined, finite. Pause here. Recall a time when life forced you into a kind of desert. Loss, illness, uncertainty, solitude. What frightened you most then? And what quietly strengthened as everything else fell away? Philosophically, this moment exposes a paradox. What you fear losing is often what was never stable to begin with. Titles change, approval fades, circumstances shift. The desert makes this undeniable, but it also reveals something that remains when everything negotiable is removed. Awareness itself, presence, the simple fact of being here, breathing, sensing, alive. Fear guards this threshold because crossing it changes orientation. You no longer look outward for permission to exist. You begin to stand on something internal. The desert night does not give answers, it removes noise. And in that silence, a question surfaces that cannot be ignored much longer. If you can survive without the structures fear told you were necessary, what else might be possible once morning comes? The brain's alarm bell, long before fear becomes a thought, it is a signal, a flash, a surge. Somewhere deep in the brain, an ancient alarm bell rings, and the body moves before the story arrives. Muscles tense, breath shortens, attention narrows. This system evolved to save your life, not to explain it. Modern neuroscience gives this alarm a name, but the experience is universal. When the brain senses threat, real or imagined, it prioritizes speed over accuracy. The world shrinks to what might go wrong. This is useful when a car swerves into your lane. It is less useful when the threat is a difficult conversation, an unfamiliar opportunity, or the risk of being seen. What matters is not that the alarm rings. What matters is what happens next. Research on attention and emotional regulation shows that when fear is met with immediate reaction, the loop reinforces itself. The body learns, yes, this was dangerous. But when fear is met with awareness, when you notice sensation without adding narrative, something different unfolds. The alarm still rings, but it no longer hijacks the entire system. Imagine standing beside a fire alarm during a drill. The sound is loud, startling. Your first impulse is to flee. But when you realize there is no fire, your body gradually settles, even as the alarm continues. The noise loses authority once context returns. Mindfulness studies point to this exact shift. When attention stays with breath, sensation, and present cues, the brain's threat response softens, not through suppression, but through integration. The alarm becomes information, not command. Try a brief experiment now. Bring to mind a mild fear, not overwhelming, just noticeable. As it arises, don't analyze it, don't argue with it. Instead, feel where it shows up physically. Chest, throat, belly. Place attention there and breathe slowly, as if giving the body permission to stay. Notice what happens after several breaths. The sensation may change shape. It may intensify briefly, then release. Or it may simply become clearer. In all cases, awareness interrupts automation. This is not about eliminating fear, it is about updating the system. For years, the brain may have treated uncertainty as danger, because no one taught it otherwise. Each conscious encounter is a recalibration, a message sent inward. We can feel this and remain intact. Philosophers once said that freedom begins at the moment between stimulus and response. Neuroscience now echoes that wisdom in different language, and this realization opens the next door. If fear is a signal processed by the brain, then what other signals have you mistaken for commands? And what might change if you learn to listen without obeying? The body's stored storm. Fear does not live only in thoughts. Long after the mind moves on, the body keeps records. In the curve of the shoulders, in the way breath hesitates, the stomach that tightens before words are spoken. The body remembers what was overwhelming when there were no words for it. There is a simple reason for this. When fear rises and action is interrupted, when you cannot run, speak, or defend, the energy has nowhere to go. It doesn't vanish, it settles, like a storm paused mid-air, waiting for permission to finish. For many people, this permission never comes. A child learns to stay quiet to avoid conflict. An adolescent learns to tense to avoid humiliation. An adult learns to hold everything together because falling apart once felt dangerous. Over time, these adaptations feel normal. The tension becomes invisible because it is constant. Somatic psychology later named what ancient cultures already sensed. The body completes what the mind avoids. Animals in the wild shake after danger passes. Their nervous systems discharge the excess energy and return to equilibrium. Humans learn to suppress that instinct in the name of control and composure. There is a quiet story often told in therapeutic circles. A dancer who could no longer feel joy in movement. Her body was precise, disciplined, admired. Yet every performance felt empty. When she finally slowed down enough to listen, she noticed her jaw was clenched even in rest. Her breath never fully reached her belly. As she began allowing small tremors, gentle sways, unplanned movements, grief surfaced, then relief. The fear stored for years began to release. Her dancing changed, so did her life. Pause and notice your own body right now. Is there an area that feels guarded, tight, numb? That place often holds an unfinished sentence from the past. This is why fear can return without warning, not because something new is wrong, but because something old is asking to be felt completely. The body does not demand understanding. It asks for presence. When sensation is allowed to move through breath, slow motion, sound, or still attention, the storm completes its cycle. What once felt like threat becomes warmth, tingling, clarity. Energy returns to circulation. This process is not dramatic, it is honest. And it changes the relationship with fear at its root. Because once you realize fear is not just a thought to fix, but a sensation to feel, the struggle softens. You stop fighting shadows and start listening to signals. And a new curiosity arises. Grounded and practical, If your body has been holding fear on your behalf for years, what might happen if you finally let it finish what it started? The doorway practice. There is a moment when fear stands like a threshold, not a wall, not a trap. More like a narrow doorway you keep pacing in front of, unsure whether to step through. Most people turn away at this point, not because they are incapable, but because no one showed them how to cross without violence toward themselves. Ancient practices were simple, almost unimpressive. They did not try to overpower fear. They approached it with methodical gentleness. Begin by naming what is here. Not the story, just the fact. Fear is present. This alone loosens the knot. Naming separates experience from identity. You are no longer swallowed by it, you are standing with it. Next, locate it. Fear always has a physical address. A pressure behind the eyes, a tightening in the chest, a hollow in the gut. Place attention there as if you were placing a warm hand on a frightened animal. No fixing, no rushing. Then soften around it. This is the step most people skip. They tense against fear, which only confirms danger. Softening does the opposite. It tells the nervous system that sensation is allowed. Breath naturally deepens when resistance eases. Allow the sensation to move. Fear rarely stays still when watched without interference. It may pulse, spread, heat up, cool down, or fade. Your role is not to direct it, but to remain present as it changes. This is how the body updates old information. Psychological traditions that focus on acceptance rather than control discovered this repeatedly. What is permitted to exist loses its need to shout. Fear grows loud when it is exiled. It settles when it is welcomed. Pause now and imagine applying this practice to a real situation, a conversation you avoid, a decision you postpone. Instead of asking, "How do I get rid of this fear?" ask, "Can I feel this fear and stay?" There is a Zen saying about a bowl filled to the brim. Nothing more can be added until something is poured out. Fear is often the fullness that prevents movement. Not because it is too much, but because it has never been allowed to empty naturally. Each time you practice this doorway, trust builds quietly. Not the loud confidence of certainty, but the steady confidence of experience. The knowledge that fear can arise, move, and pass without destroying you. And once this is known in the body, not just understood in the mind, another realization begins to form. If you can meet fear this way, what other emotions, grief, longing, joy, might also be waiting behind doors you've been taught to avoid? The Sufi candle and the thief. There is a Sufi story told quietly, almost playfully, yet it carries a sharp edge. A man wakes in the night to find a thief moving through his house. Instead of shouting or attacking, the man lights a candle and says, "If you are searching, let me help you see." The thief freezes, not from fear of being caught, but from confusion. The expected response never comes. In that moment, something shifts. The thief looks around, then looks at the man, and finally sits down. The night ends not with violence, but with tea, conversation, and an unexpected parting at dawn. Sufi teachers use this story to point toward an inner truth. What we illuminate loses its power to harm us. Fear behaves like that thief. It enters quietly, rummaging through old memories, imagined futures, half-remembered warnings. When discovered, our instinct is to attack it or throw it out. But in doing so, we confirm its authority. We treat it as dangerous, and it behaves accordingly. Rumi hinted at this paradox when he wrote that what we resist persists. and what we turn toward with presence transforms. Fear is not soothed by force. It is disarmed by understanding. Pause and notice how you usually respond when fear appears. Do you rush to distract yourself? Do you argue with it? Do you shame yourself for feeling it at all? Each of these reactions is like swinging at shadows in the dark. The candle in the Sufi story is awareness. It doesn't eliminate the thief. It reveals what is actually happening. Under the light, fear often looks smaller, more human, more tired than expected. It stops performing. Psychologically, this aligns with what happens when attention replaces avoidance. The nervous system shifts from defense to observation. The inner narrative slows. The body begins to regulate. Fear no longer needs to escalate to be noticed. Try this image the next time fear arrives. Instead of pushing it away, imagine lighting a candle inside. Not to interrogate, but to see. Ask silently, what are you protecting? Not why are you here? That question can feel accusatory. Protection implies intention, even care. Often, fear is guarding an old wound, a boundary that once mattered, a hope that was never allowed to grow. When seen, it relaxes its grip. The Sufi story does not end with the thief redeemed or punished. It ends with clarity, with choice restored. And this opens the next turn of the path. If fear softens when illuminated, what parts of your inner life have been kept in darkness simply because no one ever taught you to bring the light gently? The Zen bowl that cracked. A Zen teacher once held up a beautiful ceramic bowl before his students. It was old, thin, and flawless. This bowl, he said, is already broken. The students looked confused. He continued, I enjoy it fully now. When it breaks, I will sweep it up. That is all. The lesson was not about pessimism. It was about release. Fear often comes from clinging. Clinging to outcomes, identities, roles, and guarantees that were never permanent. The mind believes that holding tightly will prevent loss. In reality, gripping only increases tension. When fear senses that something must not be lost, it sounds the alarm. In Zen stories, the problem is rarely the event. It is the attachment to how things should be. Laozi hinted at this long ago, observing that the rigid is easily broken, while the flexible endures. Fear grows rigid when we demand certainty from a world built on change. Imagine carrying that bowl through a crowded market. Every step would feel dangerous. Every jolt would trigger panic. The bowl would own your attention. You wouldn't enjoy the walk, the sounds, or the people. You would be guarding the future instead of living the present. This is how fear narrows life. A monk once asked his teacher how to overcome fear of loss. The teacher replied, lose it now, not recklessly, but internally. Let go before life forces the lesson violently. When the mind accepts impermanence, fear loses its leverage. Pause and reflect. What bowl are you carrying as if it must never crack? An image of success, a relationship? An idea of who you are supposed to be? Notice how much energy goes into protecting it. Psychologically, clinging activates constant vigilance. The nervous system never rests because it believes catastrophe is always one step away. When clinging softens, the system recalibrates. The present moment becomes livable again. Zen practice did not aim to make people fearless. It aimed to make them present. Fear dissolves naturally when attention returns to what is actually happening rather than what might be lost. The bowl in the story eventually did break. And when it did, the teacher swept the floor calmly. The grief was real, but it was clean. not layered with years of anticipatory dread. Here is the quiet reversal. Fear is not always about danger. Often, it is about refusal to accept change. When acceptance arrives, fear no longer needs to shout. And this leads to the next unfolding insight. If clinging intensifies fear, what might become possible when you practice loosening your grip? Not on life, but on the demands you place upon it. The social spell. There is a fear that does not come from danger, loss, or pain, but from eyes, real or imagined. The sense of being watched, evaluated, measured against an invisible standard you never agreed to, yet feel compelled to meet. This fear is subtle, persistent, and deeply social. Long before laws or markets, belonging meant survival. To be excluded was to face the cold alone. That ancient wiring still hums beneath modern life, even though the threats have changed. Today, the fear is rarely exile from the tribe. It is exclusion from approval, from relevance, from being seen as enough. You feel it when you hesitate before speaking your truth, when you soften an opinion to avoid friction, when you shape your life to fit expectations that don't feel like yours. The audience may not even be present, but their imagined gaze is powerful enough. Psychologically, this fear thrives on anticipation. You don't need rejection to feel it. You only need the possibility. Brené Brown wrote that humans are wired for connection, and when belonging feels conditional, fear steps in as a manager. It tells you how to behave, what to hide, and when to stay quiet. There is a Hasidic story about a man who spends his life asking others who he should be. He becomes admired, successful, respected. Yet one night, he dreams he has died. When asked who he is, he realizes he has no answer that isn't borrowed. He wakes in terror, not of death, but of having never lived. Pause and notice where the social spell operates in your own life. Is there a version of you that only appears when others are watching? And a quieter, truer version that waits in private? Fear of judgment often masquerades as politeness, professionalism, or humility. But beneath it is a simple question. Will I still belong if I am fully seen? This fear cannot be solved by approval, because approval is temporary. It shifts with context, culture, and mood. The nervous system never fully relaxes when safety depends on performance. Yet something changes the moment you risk small acts of authenticity, not grand declarations, small truths, a boundary held, an honest no, a thought expressed without rehearsal. Each act sends a new signal inward. I can be seen and remain intact. This is not rebellion. It is alignment. Consider this gently. Name one fear of judgment you have already outgrown. At some point, something that once terrified you lost its grip. That happened not because the world changed, but because you did. The social spell weakens each time you choose presence over performance. And as it weakens, another realization waits just ahead. Courage is rarely loud. Most of the time, it is quiet, ordinary, and practiced when no one is applauding. The courage that isn't loud. We are taught to imagine courage as spectacle, a speech before a crowd, a dramatic refusal. A single moment where fear is conquered in one decisive act. But most courage never looks like that. Most courage happens quietly, without witnesses, in ordinary moments that never make stories. There is a reason this version is overlooked. Loud courage is rare. Quiet courage is daily. Think of the person who tells the truth in a small meeting, knowing it may cost approval. The one who ends a familiar pattern even though the future feels uncertain. the one who rests instead of proving. These choices do not feel heroic in the body. They feel uncomfortable, exposed, sometimes lonely. And yet, this is where fear truly loosens its grip. History offers many examples, but the pattern is consistent. Nelson Mandela spoke of courage not as the absence of fear, but as the decision to move while fear remains present. His strength was not built in a single act of defiance, but in thousands of quiet days where bitterness could have taken root and didn't. Psychologically, courage works through repetition. Each time you act in alignment with your values while fear is present, the nervous system learns something new. I can survive this. Over time, fear stops escalating because it no longer produces obedience. This mirrors what behavioral science later observed. Small, consistent actions reshape identity more reliably than dramatic resolutions. You do not wait for fear to disappear. You move with it, and it gradually loses authority. Pause and reflect. What is one small action you've avoided? Not because it's impossible, but because it feels uncomfortable, not dangerous, just exposed. Courage here does not ask for certainty. It asks for honesty. Does not require confidence. It builds confidence through experience. Ancient wisdom echoed this in quieter language. A proverb attributed to many cultures says that the path appears only as you walk it. Fear wants guarantees before movement. Courage accepts movement without guarantees. This changes the relationship entirely. Fear becomes background noise instead of a command. It may still comment, warn, predict, but it no longer decides. Notice something subtle when you imagine acting this way. The body may tense briefly, then settle. A sense of self-respect appears, not pride, grounding. This is how freedom grows, not through elimination of fear, but through consistent refusal to let fear be the author of your actions. And this prepares the ground for the next realization, perhaps the most confronting of all. If fear has been managing your choices, who might you become when you finally ask a different question? Not, what if this goes wrong, but what if this is how I learn who I am? The great question. There is a question so simple it can unsettle an entire life. It does not demand strategy, reassurance, or explanation. It waits quietly beneath every fear, patient and unrelenting. If you were not afraid, who would you become? Most people never sit with this question for long. The mind rushes to practicalities, money, timing, responsibility. But those are not answers. They are defenses. The question is not asking what you would do. It is asking who you would be. Jiddu Krishnamurti once suggested that fear distorts perception so completely that we mistake our conditioning for choice. When fear is present, decisions feel forced, inevitable. When fear loosens, possibility re-enters. Not fantasy, possibility grounded in clarity. Ancient myths encoded this moment as death and rebirth. The phoenix does not rise because it wants to. It rises because the old form can no longer contain what is becoming. Fear often appears precisely at that threshold, when the familiar identity starts to feel too small. Pause here. Let the question land without answering it yet. Notice what surfaces first: excitement, grief, resistance. These reactions are not obstacles. They are information. Psychologically, this question disrupts the default narrative. It pulls attention out of avoidance and into authorship. Instead of asking how to stay safe, it asks what wants to live. Viktor Frankl observed that when meaning is clear, fear becomes tolerable. Not gone, tolerable. Meaning reorganizes fear. Consider how different life feels when actions are guided by values rather than by threat. The body still reacts, but it no longer feels fragmented. There is coherence, direction. Many spiritual traditions frame this as liberation from authority. Not rebellion against others, but freedom from the internalized voices that dictate who you are allowed to be. When fear loses its monopoly on decision-making, another compass activates. Try a brief reflection now. Imagine fear stepping aside for just one choice. Not forever. Just once. What choice would immediately feel more honest? Notice how the question does not ask for perfection. It asks for alignment. The great question does not demand an answer today. It demands sincerity. And sincerity is powerful enough to begin dissolving old structures quietly. From the inside out, because once you glimpse who you might become without fear at the center, returning fully to the old script becomes difficult. Something has been seen, and that leads to the next unfolding. If this question reshapes how you see yourself, how might it reshape the way you move through the world, moment by moment, choice by choice? The new operating system. When fear loosens its grip, life does not suddenly become easy. It becomes clearer. And clarity changes how everything is organized. The same events occur: uncertainty, loss, effort, risk. But they are processed through a different internal system. Think of it as an update. The old operating system ran on threat detection. Its primary question was, how do I stay safe? Every decision passed through that filter. Opportunities were scanned for danger. Relationships were measured for risk. Silence was interpreted as rejection. The system was efficient but expensive. It consumed energy constantly. The new system runs on values. Instead of asking how to avoid discomfort, it asks what matters here. Instead of reacting first, it orients. Fear may still appear, but it no longer controls the interface. It becomes data, not directive. Psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi described a state where attention is fully engaged with what is meaningful, not with self-protection. In those moments, anxiety drops not because the world becomes safer, but because the mind is no longer split. Energy that once went into vigilance becomes available for presence. Notice the difference in your body when you imagine acting from values rather than fear. The posture changes. Breath deepens. There is less urgency, more steadiness. This system shift shows up practically. Boundaries become cleaner, not harsher. You say yes more slowly and no more honestly. Relationships reorganize. Some deepen. Others fall away without drama. Work gains direction, even when outcomes remain uncertain. Service emerges naturally here, not as sacrifice, but as expression. When fear no longer consumes attention, care becomes possible. You notice others more clearly. You contribute not to earn safety, but because connection feels natural. Ancient traditions framed this as right action, not moral perfection, but alignment between inner truth and outer movement. When action flows from alignment, effort feels different. It still requires energy, but it no longer drains. Pause and ask yourself quietly, where in my life am I still operating on an outdated system? The shift does not happen all at once. Systems update in the background, gradually. Each time you choose meaning over avoidance, presence over performance, the new system stabilizes. Fear may still knock. Old habits may still try to reopen. But something fundamental has changed. You know the difference now between a warning and a story, between caution and control. And this knowing sets the stage for the final turn of the journey. Because once fear is no longer in charge, a deeper question emerges, simple and grounding. How will you live now that you are no longer being managed from the inside? The unprogramming. There is a quiet moment when you realize the fear that once shaped your life no longer sits at the center. It hasn't vanished. It still appears at thresholds, still speaks in familiar tones, but it no longer decides. And that difference is everything. Unprogramming fear is not an act of rebellion. It is an act of remembering. Remembering that fear was installed through repetition, reinforced through reward and punishment, and normalized until it felt like instinct. What was programmed can be updated. What was learned can be relearned. This is where many journeys misunderstand the ending. There is no final victory where fear is destroyed. There is integration. Fear becomes a signal you listen to, not a master you obey. It points, you choose. Philosophers once wrote that freedom is not doing whatever you want, but no longer being compelled by what you fear. That freedom feels ordinary at first. You notice it in small ways, a calmer response, a slower yes, a firmer no. A choice made without inner violence. Pause here and take inventory. Not of what you have achieved, but of what has softened. What fear no longer owns. What reaction no longer runs automatically. This is the real work, living from awareness rather than reflex, from meaning rather than management, from presence rather than protection. The unprogramming continues through daily practice, through noticing when fear tries to reclaim authority, through returning to the body, the breath, the present moment, through choosing alignment over avoidance again and again. There will be days when old patterns resurface. That does not mean you have failed. It means you are alive. Each return is another opportunity to respond differently, and each different response weakens the old code. The final truth is simple and demanding. No system can control a person who is present. Presence dissolves manipulation because it restores choice, and choice is the foundation of dignity. So here is the question to carry with you. Not as pressure, but as invitation. What truth are you ready to live, even while trembling? You do not need to answer it perfectly. You only need to answer it honestly, one moment at a time. Because when one person stops being ruled by fear, something subtle changes in the world. A signal weakens. A different frequency becomes possible. And that is how freedom spreads. Quietly, steadily, from the inside out.